There is a particular kind of greed that cannot be satisfied by wealth alone. The person who has enough but needs more, not out of desperation, not out of circumstance, but out of a cold and calculated belief that what belongs to someone else should, by rights, belong to them. That kind of greed does not announce itself. It wears a suit. It shakes hands. It attends funerals. And sometimes it causes them. On the morning of March 15, 2021, a postwoman named Vera Standish was making her regular delivery run along the lane outside Hawthorne House, Kingsbridge, when she noticed that the Alderton family's 2 dogs, a pair of border collies that the family kept in an outdoor run adjacent to the house, had been barking continuously for what neighbors said had been most of the night. Vera had been delivering on this route for 9 years. She knew those dogs. They were not barkers. Not like that. She pulled up at the gate. She called out. No response. The front door of Hawthorne House was ajar. Not open, just ajar, in the way that a door is when someone who left through it neglected to pull it properly shut. Or in the way a door is when someone went through it and did not leave. Vera Standish called 999 from the gate at 7:52 a.m. The 1st Devon and Cornwall Police Response Unit arrived at 8:04 a.m. At 8:09 a.m., the officers inside Hawthorne House radioed for the force's major incident coordinator. At 8:14 a.m., the lane outside was sealed. 3 members of the Alderton family, Richard, Patricia, and their daughter Gemma, had been killed in their own home. The time of death was estimated at between 10 p.m. and midnight the previous evening. The killer or killers were gone. The dogs in the outdoor run had been barking at nothing anyone could see for 9 hours. And 42 miles away in a hotel in Bristol, a man named Martin Cole was sitting down to breakfast, checking his phone and preparing to express shock. Hawthorne House sat on 11 acres of prime South Devon farmland outside Kingsbridge, a market town of 8,000 people that sits at the head of the Kingsbridge estuary, surrounded by the rolling hills and coastal farmland of the South Hams. It was not a grand house in the way that manor houses are grand. It was a working house, stone, practical, 400 years old in its bones, that had been improved and extended by successive owners until it had become something that the local estate agents, with their reliable gift for understatement, would have described as a significant residential opportunity. Richard Alderton had grown up 50 meters from where he died. His father had farmed the land, his grandfather before that. The Alderton family's connection to this particular piece of Devon earth was not a matter of investment. It was a matter of identity. Richard had not inherited wealth. He had inherited purpose. He had known from the time he was a teenager helping his father mend fences on winter mornings, that this land was what he was for. Richard and Patricia. Richard Alderton, 58 at the time of his death, had over 30 years expanded the family's original landholding from 4 acres to 11, had converted a derelict barn into a holiday let that was booked 12 months of every year, had established a small but profitable cider apple orchard, and had, in a decision that would ultimately cost him everything, formed a business partnership with a man named Martin Cole to develop a further parcel of land adjacent to the Hawthorne House estate into a luxury residential development. Patricia Alderton, 55, was a district nurse who had served the Kingsbridge and Salcombe areas for 26 years. She was, by every account assembled after her death, the person in the family who provided its emotional architecture, the one who remembered birthdays and made time for people and had the particular quality of making whoever she was speaking to feel as though they were the only person in the room. Her colleagues at the surgery held a private memorial for her 3 days after her death. 11 of them attended. Several had to be persuaded by their line manager that they were not required to work that day. They would have come in anyway. Gemma. Gemma Alderton was 28. She had studied architecture at Cardiff, worked for 2 years at a practice in Bristol, and had returned to Devon in 2019 to help her parents manage the property portfolio, specifically the barn conversion and a second holiday property they had acquired near Salcombe. She was not a woman who had been brought back reluctantly. She had chosen to come home. Her friends described her as someone who had decided very deliberately what kind of life she wanted, and had built it rather than waited for it. She had been planning to convert the old stable block at Hawthorne House into a self-contained annex where she could work from home permanently. Planning permission had been submitted in February 2021. She had been waiting to hear back when she died. The business partnership, and the man in it. In 2017, Richard Alderton had entered into a formal business partnership with Martin Cole, a property developer from Exeter who had approached Richard after learning, through a mutual acquaintance, that the Alderton family owned a parcel of land adjacent to Hawthorne House that had, after a change to the South Hams local development plan, become viable for residential development. The land, approximately 3 acres, abutting the Hawthorne House estate to the north, had a projected development value of between £4.8 and £5.6 million if planning permission was obtained for 8 to 12 residential units. Richard and Martin had formed a joint venture company, Alderton Coal Developments Ltd, with equal shares. Richard contributed the land. Martin contributed the development expertise and the financing. Planning permission was granted in October 2020. The value of the development was now concrete rather than projected. It was real money. Life-changing money, not for Richard, for whom the land had always been about continuity rather than capital, but for Martin Cole, for whom it was very much the point. What Richard did not know, could not have known, was that Martin Cole had, by late 2020, run into serious financial difficulties elsewhere. 2 separate development projects in Exeter had gone significantly over budget. A lender was pressing for repayment on a bridging loan that had extended beyond its agreed term. Cole's personal finances were, beneath the professional surface, in a condition that the forensic accountants who would later examine them described as critical. He needed the development to proceed on terms that gave him more than 50% of the proceeds. He needed Richard Alderton out of the equation. And he had arrived, somewhere in the winter of 2020, at a conclusion about how to accomplish that. Martin Cole had not started out as a man who would commission murder. This is worth stating plainly, not to exonerate him, but because understanding how people arrive at the worst decisions they make is part of understanding how those decisions can be anticipated, investigated, and ultimately prosecuted. Cole had spent 30 years as a property developer. Largely honest, occasionally sharp in his dealings, but operating within the bounds of a competitive industry whose ethical margins are never very wide. He was not a criminal. Not until he decided to be one. The financial pressures of late 2020 had been, the evidence showed, genuinely severe. His Exeter developments had hemorrhaged £1.4 million in cost overruns. His bridge finance lender, a private credit fund, had initiated proceedings in November 2020. He had received a formal demand letter from his solicitor on the 3rd of December. He had 14 weeks to refinance or face a personal guarantee call that would have cost him his home. His 50% share of the Alderton Coal Developments land, if he could acquire the other 50% and sell the whole parcel to a house builder, would net him approximately £2.6 million. More than enough. But Richard Alderton had made it clear in a meeting between the 2 men in November 2020 that he was not interested in selling his share, that his intention was to take an active role in the development, build some or all of the units through a separate contracting arrangement, and retain long-term value from the site. Martin Cole had left that meeting and begun to look for another way. The 2 men. What Cole found, through a contact whose identity investigators spent the better part of a year establishing, were 2 men named Gary Neath, 41, and Dominic Vale, 38. Both were from Plymouth. Both had criminal records. Neath for GBH and robbery, Vale for burglary and possession with intent to supply. Neither had previously been connected to organized violence for hire. They were not professional hitmen in any cinematic sense. They were men who had been in prison and who were willing, for money, to do things that other people preferred not to do themselves. Cole made contact with Neath in January 2021, through an intermediary, a man named Paul Skett, a car dealer from Paynton with connections to Plymouth's criminal periphery. The initial conversations were described, in Skett's later police statement made under a cooperation agreement, as careful and indirect. Cole had not, in those early conversations, used words that named what he wanted. He had spoken about a problem being resolved and a situation being cleared. Skett had understood and had introduced Neath. By the second meeting between Cole, Neath and Vale at a lay-by off the A38 near Buckfastley, The words used were somewhat less indirect. By the third meeting, a payment schedule had been agreed. £20,000 in advance, £30,000 on completion. The currency of 3 lives. The advance payment was traced by investigators through a chain of cash withdrawals, informal loans, and one crucial transfer through a cryptocurrency wallet that Cole had opened under a false name but had linked, through a technical error investigators would later describe as fortunate, to an email address that was his own. He had tried to build an untraceable financial trail. He had succeeded for most of it. He had not succeeded all the way. The alibi. Cole's plan for himself was as carefully constructed as his plan for the Aldertons. On the evening of March 14, 2021, the night of the murders, he was at the Bristol Marriott City Centre Hotel, attending a 2-day property development conference. He had registered on the afternoon of the 13th. He had been seen at the evening drinks reception, at dinner, and at the morning keynote on the 14th. His room key card had been used at 11:43 p.m. on the 14th. He had returned to his room at that time, the hotel system confirmed it. He was 42 miles from Hawthorne House. He had been visible repeatedly to dozens of colleagues and conference attendees. His alibi was not just solid, it was documented, corroborated, and witnessed. Neath and Vale drove to Kingsbridge from Plymouth on the evening of the 14th. They arrived at Hawthorne House shortly after 9:30 p.m. The Alderton family was home. Richard, Patricia, and Gemma were all present. What happened between their arrival and the moment the killings were complete occupied, by the medical examiner's estimation, less than 40 minutes. By 11 p.m., Neath and Vale were back on the A38 heading west. The dogs in the outdoor run had been barking since the door closed behind them. The senior investigating officer on the Alderton murders was Detective Chief Inspector Rowena Marsh of Devon and Cornwall Police's Major Crime Investigation Team. DCI Marsh had 17 years in major crime and had led investigations into 8 homicides. She arrived at Hawthorne House at 10:45 a.m. on March 15th, 3 hours after the scene had been secured, and spent the remainder of the day walking through a crime scene that, she would later say, told a clear forensic story, and a confusing investigative one. The forensic story: the Aldertons had been killed in a coordinated attack by at least 2 individuals. The method was not impulsive or disorganized. There was no sign of a sustained struggle suggesting prolonged resistance. The attack had been fast and overwhelming. Jewelry was untouched. Richard Alderton's wallet, containing over £300 in cash, was on the kitchen table. Patricia's laptop, open, logged in, visible, had not been taken. The family's cars were in the driveway. This was not a burglary gone wrong. This was not a random attack. This was targeted. These 3 people had been killed specifically by people who had come specifically to kill them. The forensic story was clear and immediate. The investigative story, who had targeted them and why, was less immediately apparent. The Aldertons had no significant enemies that the initial canvass revealed. Richard had been involved in a planning objection dispute with a neighboring farmer in 2018, resolved without rancor. Patricia had no disputes of any kind anyone could recall. Gemma had been in Devon for less than 2 years. The business partner. The business partnership with Martin Cole emerged in DCI Marsh's first full briefing, a financial analysis of Richard Alderton's affairs assembled in the initial 48 hours by the force's Economic Crime Support Unit. Marsh flagged Cole immediately. Not as a suspect, there was no specific evidence pointing to him at this stage, but as a person with a financial connection to the deceased significant enough to warrant immediate examination. Cole was contacted by phone on the morning of March 16th. He was, by all accounts, appropriately distressed. He said the news was devastating. He said the Aldertons were wonderful people. He said he couldn't imagine who would do something like this. He said he would do anything to help the investigation. He said he would come in for an interview whenever they needed. Marsh noted in her initial interview summary 2 things. First, Cole had volunteered within the first 5 minutes of the call and without being asked, that he had been at a conference in Bristol on the night of the murders, that there would be no shortage of people who could confirm it. Second, he had not asked a single question about how the Aldertons had died. Not one. In my experience, people who have just been told that 3 members of a family they know have been murdered, the first questions they ask always are about how it happened. They want to know. They need to understand it. The fact that Mr. Cole did not ask, that he moved immediately to establishing his own location, was the first thing that made me look at him differently. Not evidence, an observation, but an observation I kept. DCI Rowena Marsh trial testimony. The financial thread. The Economic Crime Unit's analysis of Alderton Coal Developments Ltd., obtained under a production order within the first week, produced a picture that connected to the investigation in 2 significant ways. First, the development land, with planning permission granted, was now subject to a buyout clause in the joint venture agreement. Under the terms drafted in 2017, either partner could buy the other out at a valuation set by a RICS-appointed surveyor. The current valuation was £5.24 million. If either partner died, their share passed first to their estate and then, under a specific clause that Cole's solicitor had inserted during the original drafting and that Richard's solicitor had, crucially, failed to scrutinize fully, could be compulsorily acquired by the surviving partner at the surveyed valuation within 12 months of death, at the surviving partner's option. In plain terms, if Richard Alderton died, Martin Cole could buy Richard's share of a £5.24 million asset from Richard's estate at an agreed price. If Richard's entire family died, and if there were no direct heirs in a position to contest, the estate's handling of that share became considerably more straightforward for Cole to manage. Second, Martin Cole was, as of February 2021, 3 weeks away from a personal guarantee call that would have cost him his primary residence. He was not merely in financial difficulty. He was in financial extremity. And the Alderton development was the only asset he had that could resolve it. The investigation into Martin Cole's direct involvement in the Alderton murders became, from the moment DCI Marsh's team focused on him, a forensic digital exercise of considerable complexity. Cole had taken precautions. He had used a burner phone, a prepaid device purchased with cash from a Tesco in Exeter in January 2021, for all communications with Paul Skett. He had made no calls to Neath or Vale directly. He had used a cryptocurrency wallet for the financial transfer. He had been 42 miles away when the murders were committed. He had been thorough. He had not been thorough enough. The email. The cryptocurrency wallet Cole had used to transfer the advance payment to Neath, £20,000 in Bitcoin transferred in 2 tranches, had been registered under the name Michael Sanderson. There was no Michael Sanderson at the address Cole had provided. The identity was fabricated. Under normal circumstances, this might have been sufficient. But Cole had made one error, small and apparently technical, that the National Crime Agency's Cybercrime Unit identified within 3 weeks of being brought into the investigation. When creating the Michael Sanderson wallet, Cole had used a recovery email address. The email address that the wallet provider would use if the account password was ever forgotten. The recovery email was martin.cole@colaproperties.co.uk. His business email. His actual, traceable, professional email address. He had been careful in every other regard. He had, in the one moment of administrative inconvenience, setting up an account recovery option, defaulted to the path of least resistance and used his own email. The NCA investigator who found it later described the error as the kind of thing you see when someone is trying to be careful but is not naturally a criminal. Professional criminals, he said, do not have this problem because they have made enough mistakes previously to know which details matter. First-timers, or very nearly first-timers, get the big things right and trip on the small ones. That email address connected the Michael Sanderson wallet to Martin Cole. The Michael Sanderson wallet was connected, through blockchain transaction analysis, to the wallet that had sent £20,000 to Gary Neath. Cole to Neath. The financial chain was established. The phone cell data. Parallel to the financial forensics, the investigation team had been working the communications picture. Cole's burner phone, identified through a painstaking process of eliminating all registered devices from the tower data in the areas Cole had frequented, had been located as a consistent unregistered signal moving alongside Cole's own registered iPhone in the weeks before the murders. Where his registered phone went, the burner went. They were in the same pocket. On the evening of March 14th, the night of the murders, Cole's registered iPhone placed him correctly at the Bristol Marriott. His burner phone, however, showed a different pattern. Between 9:15 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., it had connected to a tower 1.2 kilometers from Hawthorne House in Kingsbridge. Cole was in Bristol. His burner phone was in Devon. The explanation was ultimately straightforward. Cole had provided the burner phone to Neath or Vale as an operational communication device for the night of the murders. They had carried it. It had placed Cole's secondary communication device at the scene. It had placed a thread from the murders directly to Martin Cole. Gary Neath and Dominic Vale were identified as suspects through the financial chain that connected Cole to Neath's receiving wallet address, and through subsequent work by Devon and Cornwall Police's intelligence unit that linked Neath's address and phone number to the wallet. Once Neath was identified, Vale was 3 steps behind him. A mutual associate, a shared address at a previous registration, a call log that placed them in contact in the week before the murders. Both were arrested at their respective Plymouth addresses in the early hours of April 28, 2021. 6 weeks after the Alderton murders, 11 days after the NCA had established the cryptocurrency chain. They were arrested simultaneously at 5:30 a.m. in coordinated raids by armed response units. Neither had left the country. Neither had significantly altered their behavior following the murders. Neath had, investigators found, spent a portion of the advance payment on a second-hand car and a fortnight's holiday in Tenerife. He had returned to Plymouth 3 weeks before his arrest. Vale had used his share to clear a debt he owed to a local moneylender. They had not behaved like men who expected to be caught. This, the NCA later observed, was consistent with the level of planning the operation had involved. Cole had done the planning, and Cole had assured them the planning was sufficient. The interview and the break. Neath said nothing in his first interview. Vale said nothing in his first 2. On the morning of Vale's 3rd interview, 2 days after arrest, with a solicitor present who had quietly indicated to Vale's legal aid representative that the evidence against his client was substantial, Vale asked to speak to the officer in charge. He was told DCI Marsh was available. He asked to speak to her specifically. She was brought to the interview room. Vale told DCI Marsh, over the following 4 hours, everything he knew about Martin Cole's arrangement with Gary Neath, about the meetings at the lay-by on the A38, about the advance payment, about the instructions they had been given regarding the Aldertons, and about the events of the night of March 14th. He gave his account in a voice that, Marsh later said, carried no evident remorse. Only the tone of a man performing the calculation of cooperation and deciding it was the best available outcome. Neath, informed that Vale had spoken, gave his own account the following morning. The 2 accounts corroborated each other on every material point. Martin Cole was arrested at his home in Exeter at 6:15 a.m. on May 2, 2021. He came to the door in a dressing gown. He said nothing when he was told he was being arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to murder. He said nothing when he was cautioned. He looked at the arresting officers with an expression that the lead arresting officer described in his statement as not surprise, more like someone who has been playing a game and has just watched the other player make the winning move and is acknowledging privately that it's over. The trial of Martin Cole, Gary Neath, and Dominic Vale opened at the Central Criminal Court on January 17, 2022, 10 months after the Alderton murders. All 3 defendants were tried together, though their legal representation remained entirely separate and their defenses were, in some respects, in direct opposition. The case for the Crown was presented by lead counsel Helena Price QC, a barrister of considerable experience in serious organized crime prosecution. She opened the trial with a statement that immediately established the framework through which all the evidence would be understood. The evidence. The prosecution presented its case over 9 days. The financial forensics came first. The NCA analyst who had found Cole's email address in the recovery field of the cryptocurrency wallet, the blockchain specialist who had traced the transaction chain from Cole to Neath. Each piece of evidence was presented with a clarity that the trial judge later commented was exemplary. The cell data evidence followed, the dual phone pattern that placed Cole's burner at Kingsbridge on the night of the murders. A telecommunications expert walked the jury through the methodology with a lucidity that allowed 12 people with no technical background to understand, without ambiguity, what the data showed. Vale's testimony, given under a cooperation arrangement that had reduced his own potential sentence in exchange for full cooperation, was the final piece. He sat in the witness box for 2 days. Cole's barrister cross-examined him for 6 hours, challenging his credibility, his self-interest, his reliability. Vale did not waver on the material facts. The defense's Cole's defense, led by Peter Ashdown QC, argued that the financial and digital evidence was circumstantial, that the email address error proved Cole had opened a cryptocurrency wallet under a false name, which was questionable behavior, but did not prove a contract killing, that the burner phone in Devon was explicable as a device he had lent to an associate without knowledge of its use, and that Vale's testimony was that of a man motivated entirely by self-interest who would say whatever. Reduced his sentence. Neath, through his barrister, offered no account. He gave evidence of nothing and maintained silence throughout. Vale's barrister read his client's cooperation statement and left the jury to draw the obvious inferences. The jury deliberated for 14 hours across 2 days. On the 16th day of the trial, February 9, 2022, they returned. The verdicts: Martin Cole, guilty on 3 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. The jury foreman read each verdict separately. At the third, Gemma's, a sound came from the public gallery. Cole's barrister placed a hand briefly on Cole's arm. Cole did not move. Gary Neath, guilty on 3 counts of murder. Dominic Vale, guilty on 3 counts of murder. His cooperation arrangement reduced his minimum tariff but did not spare him a life sentence. The trial judge, Mr. Justice Carrington, sentenced all 3 to life imprisonment. Cole's minimum tariff was set at 35 years. He was 54 years old at sentencing. He will be 89 before he is first eligible for parole consideration. His barrister made no application for the usual courtesies. There was nothing left to say. Richard Alderton had no surviving immediate family. His parents had predeceased him. Gemma was his only child. Patricia had a sister, Margaret, living in Dorset, who had, at the trial, sat in the public gallery every day with her husband and 2 adult children, all of them there in the particular way that family members attend a trial, not to watch justice but to testify to it. To be present as witnesses to the fact that Richard, Patricia, and Gemma Alderton had existed and mattered and had been taken. The Alderton Coal Developments Ltd. was wound up by the courts following Cole's conviction. The development land, the 3 acres of Devon hillside that had cost 3 lives, was sold as part of the process of administering Richard Alderton's estate. The proceeds were distributed to the estate, which, in the absence of a direct heir, ultimately passed in part to a Devon agricultural charity and in part to the NHS trust that Patricia had served for 26 years. This was not what Richard had intended for the land. It was, under the circumstances, the best that could be done with it. Paul Skett, the car dealer whose introduction of Neath to Cole had set the chain in motion, had cooperated with investigators from the moment of his initial interview, under caution, in May 2021. He gave a full account, which was used as the basis for the prosecution's understanding of how Cole had made contact with Neath. He was charged with conspiracy to commit murder as an accessory. He pleaded guilty in a separate hearing, receiving a 12-year sentence with a minimum of 6 years. He will be eligible for parole when he is 52. DCI Marsh. Rowena Marsh received a commendation from the Chief Constable of Devon and Cornwall Police in recognition of her leadership of the Alderton investigation. She has given several interviews about the case in the period since sentencing, all of them focused on the investigative methodology rather than the personal narrative. In one, she was asked what had made her certain from the beginning that Cole was involved. She gave an answer that has been quoted widely. Hawthorne House was placed on the market by the estate's administrators in late 2022. It was sold in the spring of 2023 to a family from the Midlands who had been looking for a Devon property for 3 years and who did not know, when they bought it, the history it contained. They found out, as people always do. They stayed. There is something to be said for that, though it is not comfort. The house stood for 400 years before the Aldertons. It stands after them. The land does not forget, but it does not stop either. The rooks still move in the high elm at dawn. The orchard Richard Alderton planted still produces cider apples every autumn. Things go on. But Richard Alderton, who was born 50 meters from where he died, who inherited a purpose and spent 30 years fulfilling it, who went to bed on the night of March 14, 2021 not knowing that a business partner had assigned a price to his life, Richard Alderton does not go on. Nor does Patricia, who made every person she ever spoke to feel like the most important person in the room. Nor does Gemma, who chose to come home because she knew what she wanted and was building it. They were killed for £5 million. That is the number on the document. That is the number Martin Cole had calculated. That is the number that the prosecution's opening statement named and that the jury's verdict placed on record. It is not a number that means anything at all. Greed, in its most dangerous form, is not the greed of desperation. It is the greed of entitlement, the belief that what someone else has built belongs by some private right of superiority to you. That kind of greed never announces itself. It wears a professional face. It signs contracts. It attends funerals. In Martin Cole's case, it was already planning the funerals before they happened. That is the sinister secret that this case leaves with everyone who encounters it. The person who smiles at you across a business table may have already calculated the value of your absence.